Imagine walking down a busy city street, surrounded by the noise of traffic, the chatter of people, and the bright lights of shop windows. Among the crowd, you notice something that makes your heart ache: a man and a little girl, huddled together on the cold pavement, clutching onto each other for warmth. Their clothes are worn, and their eyes, though tired, are full of love and a silent desperation. This is no ordinary pair. This is a father and his daughter, fighting to survive on the unforgiving streets. Meet Mark, a man who once had it all: a stable job, a comfortable home, and dreams of providing his daughter, Emily, with a better future. But life, as we know, can be unpredictable. A series of unfortunate events left Mark without a job, without a home, and without any support. Now, with nothing but a backpack of essentials and the will to protect his daughter, Mark is doing everything he can to keep hope alive. Emily, just 8 years old, is wise beyond her years. She doesn't fully understand why their lives have changed so drastically, but she trusts her father and clings to his strength, even when they have nothing else. The streets are a harsh place, especially for a father and his young daughter. Every day is a battle. Finding food, shelter, and safety are their constant concerns. They face the judgmental stares of passers-by, who seem to look right through them, as if they're invisible. The nights are the hardest. The cold seeps through their thin jackets, and the sounds of the city seem to magnify the fear that grips Mark's heart. How much longer can they survive like this? How much longer until something gives? But Mark refuses to give up. He's determined to find a way out, no matter how impossible it may seem. For Emily's sake, he clings to hope. Every day, they wake up to the same reality: another day on the streets. Yet, behind Mark's tired eyes is the glimmer of a man who won't quit, who believes that somehow, someway, they will find their way back to a better life. What Mark doesn't know is that their lives are about to change. It's easy to lose hope when you're at your lowest, but sometimes, when everything seems bleak, the universe has a way of surprising you. Just when Mark begins to feel that he's running out of time and options, something miraculous happens. Something that will change everything for him and Emily. But before we get to that, let's take a closer look at their journey. How did they get here? What choices did Mark have to make along the way? And most importantly, what does the future hold for them? Stay tuned to find out what happens next, because in the darkest moments, sometimes a little light can break through in ways you'd never expect. Mark hadn't always imagined his life would turn out this way. Just a year ago, he had a steady job at a local hardware store. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, kept food on the table, and gave him the comfort of knowing he could take care of his daughter. Emily had a cozy room filled with toys and books, and they lived in a small but welcoming apartment. Things were simple, but they were enough. Mark had even begun saving a little money on the side, hoping to take Emily on a trip to the beach for the first time. She loved the idea of building sandcastles and dipping her toes into the ocean. He promised her it would happen soon. But that promise, like so many others, would fade as everything fell apart. It started with a series of layoffs at the store. Business was slow, and Mark was one of the first to be let go. At first, he thought he could bounce back. He had experience, he was hardworking, and surely he'd find something else quickly. But weeks turned into months, and the job market wasn't kind. His savings dried up faster than he'd imagined. The rent fell behind, and soon, Mark found himself unable to make ends meet. The landlord, though sympathetic at first, couldn't wait forever. One cold morning, Mark received the eviction notice. He felt a weight settle in his chest, knowing he had no other options left. Leaving the apartment was heartbreaking. He tried to shield Emily from the worst of it, telling her that they were going on an adventure, but even at her young age, she could sense something was wrong. She didn't complain though. Emily was a quiet child, always observing, always thinking. She trusted her father more than anyone else in the world, and in her eyes, as long as they were together, they would be okay. Mark wished he could share that certainty, but the truth was, he was terrified. The first few nights on the streets were the hardest. They managed to find a spot under a bridge, away from the wind, but it was still unbearably cold. Mark tried to keep Emily as warm as possible, wrapping her in the only blanket they had. She shivered in his arms, and the helplessness he felt in that moment was overwhelming. He spent hours each night, staring up at the grey sky, wondering how it had all come to this. He felt like a failure, not just as a father, but as a person. He had promised Emily so much more than this. Days passed in a blur of trying to find food, shelter, and a little bit of hope. Mark quickly learned that survival on the streets required more than just strength. It required a certain level of grit, a willingness to push through the constant uncertainty and fear. Every day was a new challenge, whether it was finding a meal or keeping Emily safe from the dangers of the city. They spent their days walking, always moving, always searching for a place to rest for a while. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. But Mark couldn't afford to break down. Emily needed him to be strong. Along the way, they met other homeless people, each with their own stories of how they had ended up in this situation. Some were kind, offering tips on where to find shelters or food, while others kept to themselves, wrapped up in their own struggles. Mark learned quickly that trust was hard to come by on the streets. Everyone was looking out for themselves, and desperation could make people do things they wouldn't normally do. Still, there were moments of kindness, small gestures, that reminded Mark that not everyone had lost their humanity. A stranger would offer a sandwich, or someone would point them toward a soup kitchen that was serving meals that day. Those small acts of generosity were what kept them going. Emily, for her part, remained brave. She didn't complain, even when her stomach growled with hunger, or when the nights were too cold to sleep. She stayed close to Mark, holding his hand tightly as they navigated the busy city streets. But Mark could see the toll it was taking on her. She wasn't the carefree little girl she had once been. The weight of their situation was beginning to show in the way her shoulders slumped, or how she no longer asked when they'd go back home. The hardest part for Mark was realizing that Emily no longer expected things to get better. One day, as they sat on the steps of an old church, Mark watched as Emily stared off into the distance. Her eyes, once full of wonder, now seemed tired, as though she had seen too much for her young age. He wanted to tell her that things would be okay, that they would find a way out of this, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. They had been on the streets for too long, and he had no answers. He could only hope that anything would change soon. The church doors creaked open, and an older woman stepped out. She glanced at Mark and Emily, her eyes soft with sympathy. She introduced herself as Sister Agnes, and offered them a warm meal inside. Mark hesitated for a moment, not wanting to take charity, but Emily's hopeful eyes made the decision for him. They followed the woman inside, and for the first time in what felt like ages, they sat down to a hot meal. The soup was simple, but it was the best thing Mark had tasted in weeks. He watched as Emily eagerly ate, her spirits lifting just a little. Sister Agnes sat with them, asking about their story, listening without judgment. She had seen many people in similar situations come through the church, and while she couldn't offer much, she gave them a place to rest for a few hours. She told Mark about a shelter nearby that might have space, but warned him that it was always full. It was a small glimmer of hope, but Mark knew that nothing was guaranteed. As they left the church that evening, Mark felt a mixture of gratitude and despair. The kindness of strangers had kept them afloat, but it wasn't enough to change their circumstances. They needed more than just a meal here and there. They needed stability. They needed a miracle. That night, as they huddled together under the stars, Mark found himself praying for the first time in years. He wasn't a religious man, but in that moment, he felt the weight of desperation pushing him to ask for help from anyone or anything that might be listening. He didn't ask for much, just a chance, a way to give Emily the life she deserved. As he whispered his plea into the darkness, he felt Emily stir beside him. She looked up at him with tired eyes, and for the first time in a while, she asked a question. "Daddy, when will we have a home again?" Mark's heart clenched. He didn't have an answer. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Soon, sweetheart. I promise." But promises were harder to keep now. And as he lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the city, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Something had to change. But what? And when? The next day, the streets felt even colder than usual. Mark and Emily wandered, trying to find a place to rest. They passed by countless people, faces blurring together, as if they were invisible once again. But then, something happened that made Mark stop in his tracks. A man in a suit, walking briskly down the street, glanced their way. At first, it seemed like just another dismissive glance, but the man stopped, turned around, and began walking toward them. Mark tensed. He wasn't sure what to expect. The man looked out of place in this part of town, clean-cut, well-dressed, and in a hurry. But as he approached, there was something different in his eyes. Compassion? Curiosity? Mark couldn't quite tell. The man reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to Mark without a word. Then, with a nod, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Mark stared at the card in his hand, confused. It didn't make sense. Why had this stranger given him a business card? He looked down at it, his hands shaking slightly. The name on the card was unfamiliar, and the words printed beneath it only deepened the mystery. Mark stared at the business card in his hand, the edges slightly crumpled from his nervous grip. The name on it didn't mean anything to him. Daniel Hayes, founder and CEO. The company name printed beneath was even less familiar, Hayes Initiatives. Mark's heart raced as he turned the card over, looking for some kind of clue, but it was just a standard business card, crisp and professional. Why would a complete stranger hand him something like this? What could it possibly mean? He wasn't sure whether to feel hopeful or skeptical, but something in his gut told him this was important. Emily tugged at his sleeve, pulling him back to the present. "Daddy, who was that man?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Mark shook his head. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know." His voice was tight, filled with uncertainty. The encounter was so strange that it left him unsettled. But there was no time to dwell on it. They still needed to find a place for the night. As they continued walking, Mark's mind kept drifting back to the card. Could it be some kind of opportunity? Or was it just a meaningless gesture, a moment of pity from a man who had more than enough to give? The streets were full of empty promises, and Mark had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. But something about the brief encounter felt different. Why would someone in a suit, someone who looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not walking around this part of town, go out of his way to approach them? Mark slid the card into his pocket and tried to push the thoughts aside. Tonight, they just needed to get through one more night. Tomorrow, he'd think about the card and maybe try calling the number printed on it. If nothing else, it would give him something to focus on besides the endless cycle of survival. But even as he tried to put it out of his mind, a strange sense of anticipation started building inside him. It was a small flicker, but for the first time in a long while, Mark felt something close to hope. The night fell quickly, and the streets grew even colder. Mark and Emily found a spot near a closed storefront where they could huddle together under the awning. It wasn't ideal, but at least it kept the wind off their faces. Emily rested her head on Mark's chest, and though her body was still, he knew she wasn't asleep. She hadn't slept soundly in weeks. Neither had he. Mark lay awake, staring at the dark sky above, his thoughts swirling. He wondered how long they could keep going like this. Every day was a test of endurance, and though he tried to stay strong for Emily, there were moments when he felt himself unraveling. He couldn't let her see that, though. She needed to believe that he could take care of her, even when everything felt hopeless. In the distance, the sounds of the city continued, the hum of cars, distant voices, and the occasional siren. It was a strange contrast to the quiet desperation of their situation. Life went on for everyone else, while Mark and Emily were stuck in this endless limbo, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The next morning, after a restless night, Mark decided it was time to do something about the card. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be a turning point. With Emily by his side, they walked to the nearest public phone, Mark pulling the card from his pocket and dialing the number slowly, his hands shaking slightly. Each beep of the dial tone felt like it stretched on forever. He had no idea what he was going to say. The line clicked, and a woman's voice answered. "Hayes Initiatives, how can I help you?" Mark froze for a moment, caught off guard by the formality of it all. He cleared his throat, trying to sound calm. Hi. My name is Mark, and I was given a business card." He glanced at the name again, Daniel Hayes. There was a brief pause on the other end. One moment, please. The line went quiet, save for the soft music playing in the background. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he waited. What if this was all just a mistake? What if the man had given him the card by accident? After what felt like an eternity, a deep voice came through the line. This is Daniel Hayes. How can I help you? Mark swallowed hard. You gave me your card yesterday. I'm not sure if you remember, but I'm in a bit of a tough situation right now, and I wasn't sure what. I remember, the man interrupted, his tone calm but direct. I've been looking for you, actually. Mark blinked, confused. Looking for me? I don't understand. Daniel's voice was steady, almost reassuring. I run an initiative that helps families in need, particularly those experiencing homelessness. When I saw you and your daughter, I knew I wanted to offer assistance. If you're interested, we can meet today to discuss how we can help. Mark felt a mix of relief and suspicion. It sounded too good to be true. You want to help us? Why? I mean, You're not just anything, Daniel said firmly. You and your daughter deserve a chance, just like anyone else. I've seen too many people fall through the cracks, and I'm in a position to do something about it. Mark stood there speechless. Was this really happening? He had been let down so many times before, and the thought of putting his trust in a stranger again felt risky. But at the same time, he couldn't afford not to take the chance. Emily was depending on him. Okay, Mark said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay, let's meet. Daniel gave him an address and office downtown, not far from where they were. Mark scribbled it down, his hand trembling. He hung up the phone and looked down at Emily, who had been standing quietly beside him, watching his every move. She didn't say anything, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a reflection of the cautious optimism Mark was feeling. As they made their way toward the address, Mark's mind raced with questions. Who exactly was Daniel Hayes? Why had he singled them out? And most importantly, what did this help look like? The tension in his chest grew with each step, a mix of hope and fear battling inside him. He had been let down before, and the thought of getting Emily's hopes up, only to have them crushed again, was almost too much to bear. When they arrived at the building, Mark hesitated at the door. It was a sleek, modern office, far removed from the harsh realities of the street. The contrast felt jarring. He looked down at Emily, who squeezed his hand tightly, and together they stepped inside. The receptionist greeted them warmly, and within minutes, they were ushered into a private office where Daniel Hayes was waiting. He stood as they entered, offering a kind smile. He didn't look like the typical business executive Mark had imagined. There was something genuine in his demeanor, something that made Mark feel, if only for a moment, that maybe this wasn't just another dead end. Daniel gestured for them to sit, and as they did, the weight of the moment pressed down on Mark's shoulders. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that whatever was about to happen could change everything. He just didn't know if it would be for better or worse. Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding as Daniel sat across from them, ready to explain the offer that could either lift them out of their nightmare or leave them even more lost than before. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, every second stretching out as Mark waited for the words that would determine their future. Would this be the break they so desperately needed? Or was there more to this offer than met the eye? The tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Mark sat across from Daniel Hayes, trying to steady his nerves. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he forced himself to stay calm. This meeting felt like it could be the turning point, the miracle he'd been praying for, but he knew better than to expect easy answers. Life had taught him that nothing came without a cost. Emily sat beside him, her small hand still gripping his, her eyes wide with curiosity and hope. Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Mark," he began, "I understand how difficult things must have been for you and Emily. I've seen many families in similar situations, and I want to help you get back on your feet." Mark nodded, but a part of him was bracing for the catch. There was always a catch. "What kind of help are you offering?" he asked cautiously. Daniel smiled, sensing Mark's hesitation. "We run a program that provides housing, job assistance, and educational support for children. We can get you a place to stay immediately, and will work with you to find stable employment. The goal is to give families like yours a fresh start. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Housing? A stable job? It sounded too good to be true. For a moment, the idea of having a roof over their heads, a place where Emily could feel safe and warm, seemed like a dream. But as much as he wanted to believe in this sudden stroke of luck, something about it didn't sit right with him. Why them? Why now? I appreciate the offer, Mark said slowly, but why us? There are so many people in need out there. Why did you pick us? Daniel's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. You're right to ask that, he admitted. I'm not just offering this out of charity. There's something I need to tell you, something that I didn't mention over the phone. Mark's stomach tightened. This was it. The catch. He glanced at Emily, who was watching them closely, and his protective instincts flared. He didn't know what was coming next, but whatever it was, he had to be ready. Daniel hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. A few months ago, I came across some information that's complicated, he began. I can't go into all the details right now, but it involves my organization and a project we've been working on. It's not just about helping the homeless, it's about uncovering something bigger. Something that could change the way people think about poverty and how we address it. Mark frowned, confused. What does that have to do with us? Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. You and Emily aren't just any father and daughter. You're part of something larger, something I believe could make a real difference. I've been watching your situation for a while, and there's a reason I found you when I did. You're connected to this in ways you don't even realize. Mark's head spun. Connected? What are you talking about? Daniel glanced at Emily, then back at Mark, lowering his voice. There's something you need to know about your past, something that's tied to the work we're doing. I don't think it's a coincidence that you've ended up in this situation, and I believe helping you could reveal something important. But it's not without risk. Mark's pulse quickened. This wasn't the straightforward offer of help he had imagined. There was something deeper going on, something he didn't fully understand. He had spent the past year just trying to survive, and now this man was telling him that his situation was part of some larger plan. It didn't make any sense. I'm not sure what you're saying, Mark said, his voice tight with frustration. We're just trying to get by. We don't want to be part of any experiments or whatever this is. Daniel shook his head quickly. It's not like that, Mark. I promise. I want to help you, but there are people out there who wouldn't be as kind. The work we're doing is controversial, and not everyone wants to see it succeed. If you choose to accept our help, you'll be safe. But if you walk away, things could get difficult. For both of you. Mark's mind raced. This was going from strange to dangerous in a matter of seconds. The stakes were suddenly higher than he had imagined. It wasn't just about getting a roof over their heads anymore. It was about something else, entirely something that sounded like it could put them in harm's way. He looked at Emily, her innocent face staring up at him, and his heart twisted. He couldn't drag her into something that might put her in danger, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the possibility of getting the help they so desperately needed. Daniel seemed to sense Mark's internal struggle. I know this is a lot to take in, he said softly. And I don't expect you to make a decision right now. But just know that if you accept our help, we'll do everything we can to protect you and give you a real chance at starting over. This isn't a simple charity offer. It's something much bigger than that. Mark felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. He had thought this meeting might be their way out, but now it felt like he was stepping into a situation far more complicated than he could have anticipated. He had no idea what Daniel was really involved in or what this mysterious project was about, but the urgency in his voice made it clear that turning away might not be as simple as it seemed. I need to think about it, Mark said finally, his voice strained. Daniel nodded. Of course. Take your time. But don't take too long. There are forces at play here that are beyond our control, and I don't want to see you and Emily get caught in the middle. Mark stood up, feeling a mix of fear and uncertainty tightening in his chest. He took Emily's hand and led her out of the office, his mind swirling with questions. What had just happened? Was Daniel telling the truth, or was this all some elaborate trap? And if it was real, What did it mean for them? As they stepped out into the cool air, Mark looked down at Emily, her small face filled with a mixture of confusion and trust. She had no idea how complicated things had just become. And that was the hardest part for Mark. He had to make a choice, one that could either save them or put them in even more danger. They walked in silence for a while, Mark's thoughts racing. He wanted to believe that Daniel was offering a real chance, but the way he had spoken, the cryptic warnings about forces and connections to their past, made him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was lurking beneath the surface. Just when he thought he couldn't handle any more uncertainty, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. Mark hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding. The message was short, but it sent a chill down his spine. Be careful who you trust. They're not telling you everything. Mark stared at the screen, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had no idea who had sent the message, but one thing was clear, this was far from over. And whatever was coming next, it was about to push him and Emily to the edge. Mark stared at the phone in his hand, the message glaring back at him like a warning. Be careful who you trust. They're not telling you everything. The words echoed in his mind as he walked down the street with Emily. His instincts told him to run, to get as far away from all of this as possible. But where could they go? They were already living on the edge, barely surviving day to day. Now, the choice before him felt impossible: walk away and risk losing the only chance they had at a better life, or dive into something that could potentially put them in danger. That night, as they huddled together in their usual spot, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on them. He kept glancing over his shoulder, wondering who had sent the text, wondering if someone was watching their every move. Emily slept fitfully beside him, unaware of the storm brewing in her father's mind. The next morning, Mark made a decision. He couldn't let fear rule him any longer. He had to know the truth, whatever it was. With Emily by his side, he walked back to the office building where Daniel had offered his strange proposition. The walk felt longer this time, the tension in the air thickening with each step. Mark's mind raced with questions. Was Daniel really trying to help them, or was he part of something darker? When they arrived, Daniel greeted them with the same calm demeanor, but this time, Mark wasn't going to let the politeness fool him. I need answers, he said, his voice firm. No more games. What is this really about? What do you know about us? Daniel's expression hardened, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something behind the man's eyes, something cautious, maybe even fearful. I told you, Mark, there are things I can't explain fully right now. But I assure you, we want to help. That's not good enough, Mark snapped. You're talking about forces and connections. What aren't you telling me? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair as if debating how much to reveal. All right, he said quietly. You deserve to know the truth. But you need to understand, this is bigger than just you and Emily. He gestured for them to sit, and Mark, with a pounding heart, sat down. Emily climbed into his lap, sensing the seriousness of the moment. You see, Daniel began, the initiative I'm part of isn't just about providing housing or jobs. We've been working on something much larger, something that involves tracking patterns of poverty, displacement, homelessness. We've noticed strange coincidences in people's histories. Certain families, certain individuals, seem to fall into these cycles over and over, like they're being pulled into it. Mark frowned, trying to follow. What does that have to do with us? Daniel met his eyes. You and Emily are part of one of those families. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What? I don't know all the details yet, Daniel admitted, but I know that your family's history has been manipulated, for lack of a better word. You've been placed in certain situations, hard situations, by people who are trying to prove something. I don't know who's behind it, but it's clear that someone has been orchestrating your downfall. Mark felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. Manipulated? Orchestrated? The words made him feel like a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Why? He whispered. Why would anyone do that? Daniel hesitated, then leaned in closer. We think it's part of a larger experiment. Someone out there is using families like yours to prove a point, either about the limits of human resilience or the failures of society. I don't know their exact motive, but I do know they're powerful. And if you're not careful, they'll keep pulling the strings. Mark felt the room spin around him. His whole life, everything he'd been through, the homelessness, the constant struggle, it hadn't just been bad luck. It had been planned, controlled. He looked down at Emily, her innocent face watching him, and his heart ached. How could he protect her from something he couldn't even understand? So what now? Mark asked, his voice low. How do we stop it? Daniel's face grew darker. That's the problem. We don't know who they are, or how far their reach extends. But we've been able to shield some families, to help them break free from the cycle. That's what I'm offering you, Mark, a way out. But you need to trust me. If you walk away now, they'll keep coming after you. And I don't know if we'll be able to help you next time. Mark's mind raced. It was all too much to process the idea that his life had been manipulated, that some unseen force had been controlling their fate. But there was something else, too, something Daniel hadn't said, but Mark could feel it in his bones. There was still a part of the story he wasn't hearing. Before he could ask more questions, Daniel's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen, and Mark saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. They know, Daniel whispered, standing up abruptly. We have to go. Now? Mark's pulse quickened. Who knows? They've found us, Daniel said urgently. We don't have much time. Without another word, Daniel grabbed his coat and motioned for Mark and Emily to follow. Mark's legs felt like lead as he rose, clutching Emily's hand. They hurried out of the office, down a back stairwell, and into the alley behind the building. As they stepped outside, Mark's phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number, run. Before Mark could process it, the roar of an engine filled the alley. A black SUV screeched around the corner, heading straight for them. Daniel pulled Mark and Emily to the side, barely avoiding the speeding vehicle. The SUV came to a sudden halt, and two men in dark suits jumped out, their faces cold and expressionless. Mark's heart pounded as he realized these were the people Daniel had been warning them about. The ones pulling the strings. The ones who had been controlling his life. We don't have time for this, Daniel muttered. Get in. He pointed to a narrow alley on the other side of the street, motioning for Mark and Emily to run. Without thinking, Mark grabbed Emily and sprinted, his mind racing. Behind him, he could hear the men shouting, their footsteps closing in. Every instinct screamed at him to keep running, to protect his daughter. But just as they rounded the corner, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the alley. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, his heart racing, and saw Daniel fall to the ground, clutching his side. The men were closing in, their eyes locked on Mark and Emily. It was in that moment, as everything seemed to unravel, that Mark realized the final, horrifying truth. This wasn't just about them. This wasn't just some experiment or manipulation. He and Emily weren't victims. They were the final piece of the puzzle. And now, with Daniel down and the men closing in, there was only one way this was going to end. Mark's mind raced, his heart pounding as he made his choice. He wasn't going to let them control his fate anymore. This time, he would fight back. He grabbed Emily's hand and ran, the final twist revealing itself in the darkness behind them. Mark's legs burned as he sprinted down the narrow alley, Emily's small hand gripped tightly in his own. His heart thundered in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last, but he refused to stop. The sound of footsteps behind him was closing in. Whoever these people were, whatever they wanted, Mark knew he had to keep Emily safe. Nothing else mattered now. They turned a corner, into a busier street, blending into the crowd. Mark's mind raced, searching for a plan, for any way out of this. He glanced back, but the men weren't far behind. He could see their cold expressions, their determination. These weren't just random thugs, there was something more dangerous about them. He needed to disappear, fast. Up ahead, he spotted an open door leading into a convenience store. Without thinking, he pulled Emily inside, ducking down behind one of the aisles. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to stay calm, listening to the sounds of the street outside. The men rushed past the store, unaware they had slipped inside. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but Mark forced a smile, trying to reassure her. "We're okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. They stayed hidden for a few minutes, long enough for Mark to catch his breath and think. He couldn't keep running forever. These people clearly had resources, connections, and no matter how fast he ran, they would find him again. He needed a real plan, a way to end this once and for all. His mind flashed back to Daniel. He had been their only link to understanding what was happening. But now, with Daniel gone, Mark was left to figure it out on his own. Whatever Daniel had been trying to protect them from, it was bigger than he could have imagined. But then, another thought hit him. The text message. Someone else had been watching someone who knew more than Daniel had let on. Mark pulled out his phone, scrolling back to the mysterious message, "Be careful who you trust. They're not telling you everything." He hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. He didn't know who had sent it, but at this point, he had nothing left to lose. Mark typed a quick response. "Who are you? What do you want?" He pressed send, hoping for answers. Seconds later, his phone buzzed again. The reply was instant. "Meet me at the old factory on Riverton Road. I'll explain everything." Mark's stomach twisted. It felt like another trap, but what choice did he have? He couldn't keep running in circles, and if there was a chance to end this, he had to take it. He looked down at Emily, her trusting eyes watching him. He needed to make sure this was over, once and for all. Without wasting any more time, Mark scooped Emily up and made his way out of the store, keeping a low profile as they headed toward Riverton Road. The old factory wasn't far, just on the outskirts of the city, a place Mark had passed 100 times, but never paid much attention to. Now it seemed like their only hope. As they approached the factory, Mark felt his nerves tighten. The building was abandoned, its windows broken, and the walls covered in graffiti. It looked like the perfect place for an ambush, but Mark pushed those thoughts aside. He had to see this through. He stepped inside, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The place was eerily quiet, and every shadow seemed to move in the dim light. Mark's heart raced, but he kept going, Emily clinging to him. In the center of the large, empty room, a figure stood waiting. It was a woman, dressed in dark clothes, her face partially obscured by the shadows. She looked up as Mark approached, her expression calm but intense. "You came?" she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of understanding. Mark narrowed his eyes, keeping his distance. "Who are you? What's going on?" The woman stepped forward, her gaze shifting to Emily before looking back at Mark. "My name is Claire. I'm part of the group that's been trying to stop this experiment. You and Emily were never supposed to be involved, but things got out of control. I'm here to make it right." Mark felt a surge of anger. "Out of control? You're saying this whole thing, our lives were just some kind of experiment?" Claire sighed, her expression softening. "It's more complicated than that. The organization behind this, let's just say they've been trying to understand how people like you, people in difficult circumstances, respond to extreme hardship. They manipulate events, control outcomes, to see what happens. But we never agreed to it. We've been fighting them from the inside, trying to expose the truth." Mark's fists clenched. "So we were just pawns? Just pieces in their twisted game?" "Yes," Claire admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But it wasn't supposed to go this far. When we realized how dangerous things had become, we tried to pull you out. That's why Daniel was helping you. He was one of the good ones. But now with him gone, you need to trust me. I can help you escape, but we don't have much time." Mark's mind raced. Everything she was saying made sense, but it still felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice hard. "Because I've been where you are," Claire said quietly. "I was part of the same experiment. My family, my life, they tore it apart, just like they're doing to you. But I got out, and I've been trying to stop them ever since. I don't want to see the same thing happen to you and Emily." Mark studied her for a long moment, trying to gauge if she was telling the truth. There was something in her eyes, something genuine, that made him believe she wasn't lying. But there was still so much he didn't understand. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire glanced around the empty factory, her expression tense. "There's a safe house. A place they don't know about. I can take you there, but we need to move quickly. Once we're there, We can figure out how to expose them, how to stop this once and for all. Mark hesitated, but then he looked down at Emily. She had been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep putting her in danger. If there was a chance to end this, to finally give her the life she deserved, he had to take it. "Okay," he said, his voice firm. "Let's go." Claire nodded, her expression determined. Together, they left the factory, slipping into the shadows of the night as they made their way to the safe house. Mark's heart was still pounding, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally coming to an end. They arrived at the safe house an hour later, a small, unassuming building hidden away in a quiet part of town. Inside, it was simple but comfortable, a stark contrast to the chaos they had been running from. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him as he sat down, pulling Emily close. Claire wasted no time, immediately getting to work on a plan. She explained that they needed to gather evidence, to expose the organization, and bring their crimes to light. It wouldn't be easy, but with Daniel's information, and the help of a few insiders still on their side, they had a chance. Over the next few days, Mark and Claire worked tirelessly, piecing together everything they had learned. Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to not only protect Emily, but to fight back against the people who had tried to control their lives. The more they uncovered, the more the full scope of the organization's manipulations became clear. They weren't just experimenting on a few families, they were pulling the strings on entire communities, using poverty and hardship as tools for their own twisted agenda. Finally, after days of preparation, they were ready. Claire had managed to leak the information to a trusted journalist, someone who had been investigating the organization for years. The truth was about to come out, and there would be no hiding from it. The night before the story was set to break, Mark sat with Emily, holding her close as she slept. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that this ordeal was almost over, fear of what might still come, and a deep, overwhelming love for his daughter. She had been his strength through all of this, his reason to keep fighting. The next morning, the news broke. Headlines across the country exposed the truth about the organization and its experiments. There was outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. The people responsible were arrested, and the full extent of their manipulations was revealed to the world. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he could breathe. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. As he and Emily stood outside the safe house, watching the sunrise, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. They had made it. They were free. But even in that moment of victory, there was a lingering question in his mind, a question he wasn't sure he'd ever have the answer to. How many others had been trapped in the same cycle? How many more lives had been manipulated, controlled, and torn apart? Mark didn't know. But what he did know was that he and Emily were no longer part of that cycle. They had broken free, and now they had a chance to build a new life. A life that was truly their own. With the sun rising on a new day, Mark took Emily's hand, and together, they walked toward their future.